Yes, the Old Testament does speak about hell and the final fate of the lost, and this crucial information should not be ignored. I'm continuing a series examining the biblical doctrine of hell and the view known as conditional immortality, also called annihilationism. In these next few episodes, I'll focus specifically on what the Old Testament has to say about the final fate of the lost. Unfortunately, some people downplay or even ignore entirely this part of the Bible when discussing hell. But the Old Testament makes up over 3/4 of our Bibles and has quite a bit to say about divine judgment and final punishment. Much of the confusion comes from asking the wrong questions. If you search the Old Testament looking for explicit references to eternal conscious torment or even the word hell, you'll be looking in vain. But that's not the right approach. When we instead ask, what does the Old Testament say about the final fate of the lost, a remarkably clear and consistent picture emerges, one that aligns closely with the doctrine of conditional immortality. That is, that eternal life is a gift only for the faithful, whereas those who reject God will suffer the penalty of death, the destruction of body and soul. Let's start with the book of Isaiah. Did you know that Isaiah is the most quoted Old Testament prophet in the New Testament? So clearly, this is a book and prophet the New Testament authors relied upon. Let's start in Isaiah 66:24. Isaiah says, "And they, that is the righteous, shall go out and look at the dead bodies of the people who have rebelled against me, that is God. For their worms shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." Ironically, this passage is often cited by advocates of eternal torment, when in reality it provides strong support for conditional immortality. The context of this passage are the end times, as Isaiah specifically speaks of the new heavens and new earth. Danny Burke notes, verse 22 identifies the new heavens and the new earth as the context for these statements, indicating that Isaiah is looking far beyond the immediate events of his own day to the eschatological renewal of heaven and earth. Edward Fudge writes that Isaiah closes in chapter 66 with an all-encompassing picture, a scene from the new heavens and the new earth. In Isaiah 66, speaking of these future events, God declares he is about to restore his creation in verse 22. Fudge says this passage provides a visual postscript, a victorious afterword that underscores God's universal triumph and reaffirms the safety of his people. What is so critical to note in this final depiction is that the rebellious are said to be dead bodies, corpses. There's nothing here to suggest some eternal conscious torment or even a universal reconciliation. Instead, what we see are God's enemies slain by him. They come to an end, as they are corpses, dead bodies. Isaiah warns that God's indignation is against his enemies in verse 14. He will come in fire and in just anger, executing judgment, and those slain by the Lord shall be many, in verses 15 and 16, as the wicked shall come to an end altogether. God's judgment against evildoers will leave none alive. This all leads up to the passage in verse 24. The righteous look upon the dead bodies or corpses of the people who have rebelled against God. The worms in fire described alongside the corpses are worms in fire that shall not die or be quenched before accomplishing their task of consuming the bodies. Unquenchable fire is a fire that cannot be prevented from completing its mission. The worms in fire are thus not necessarily immortal. But even if you think they are eternal, that would not at all suggest that dead bodies are anything more or less than dead bodies. Fudge explains, in Isaiah's vision, the worms do not die, at least not until they finish their consumptive task. However, even if the worms in fire were said to be immortal, that would neither transform dead bodies into living people, nor redefine the worm's mission from one of consuming to one of tormenting, nor reconstitute the corpses they had consumed. However you understand the worms in fire, what is abundantly clear is that they are devouring dead bodies. These corpses are said to be an abhorrence, an object of contempt for all humanity. As Fudge points out, it is not a picture of pain, but of shame. The wicked are thoroughly dead. The disgusting image of death is repulsive to the living. Nothing here at all suggests an eternal conscious torment. This is a destructive act by God towards the lost in his day of judgment. Recall Psalm 110:6, speaking in the context of God's day of wrath in verse 5. God will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. This day of wrath is the eschatological day of Yahweh, a day of salvation and judgment, and God's kingdom is fully consummated. Stephen Dempster writes that the day of Yahweh was, quote, a day when Yahweh would decisively act in history. The great eschatological day is a decisive act of judgment by which the kingdom will be realized completely in human history. Sinners will be destroyed and the righteous vindicated. Therefore, the depiction from Isaiah in chapter 66 reveals God's restored creation, the new heavens and the new earth. In this imagery, God's judgment against his enemies is displayed. What is evident is that the ultimate fate of the lost is death and destruction. They are dead bodies, corpses. This is anything but eternal conscious torment. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the next episode, we'll be looking at Daniel 12:2, another passage that speaks directly to the final fate of the lost. I'll see you then.